On the evening of October 22nd, 1962, at approximately 9:30 p.m., KGB officers arrived at a Moscow apartment building in a quiet residential district to arrest a man whose espionage activities had, over the previous 18 months, compromised some of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded military secrets. The man they came to arrest was Colonel Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky, age 43, a decorated Soviet military officer who held the rank of colonel in the GRU, the main intelligence directorate of the Soviet armed forces. Outside, the first snow of what would prove to be a particularly harsh winter had begun to fall over Moscow. Inside apartment 47, Penkovsky sat with his wife Vera and their 2 daughters, having just finished dinner, unaware that within minutes his double life would be exposed and his family's existence would be destroyed. The timing of the arrest was not coincidental. Just 1 day earlier, President John F. Kennedy had publicly announced the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba and had imposed a naval blockade of the island. The world stood closer to nuclear war than at any moment in human history, and the intelligence that had allowed American leaders to understand exactly what those missiles were capable of, their range, their accuracy, their vulnerabilities, had come from the man now being taken into custody. Before we continue with how a Soviet colonel became one of the West's most valuable intelligence assets and how his actions shaped the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We document these classified Cold War operations every week, bringing you the verified truth behind some of history's most consequential intelligence cases. Now, let's examine how Oleg Penkovsky's choices would destroy his family and alter the course of superpower confrontation. When KGB officers knocked on the door that October evening, Vera Penkovsky answered, expecting perhaps a neighbor or a delayed delivery. Instead, 6 men in dark coats pushed past her into the apartment. The lead officer identified himself and informed Vera that her husband was being arrested for high treason and espionage against the Soviet state. Oleg, who had been reading a newspaper in the living room, stood as the officers entered. According to Vera's later testimony during her own interrogation, Oleg said nothing. He simply looked at her and their daughters, Galina, age 15, and Marina, age 12, with an expression she would later describe as resignation mixed with profound sadness. The children, awakened by the commotion, came into the living room to find their father being handcuffed. Marina began crying, asking what was happening, why men were taking her father away. The KGB officers ordered Vera to take the children into their bedroom and keep them there. For the next 4 hours, while her daughters asked questions she could not answer, Vera listened to the sounds of her apartment being systematically torn apart. Drawers opened and emptied, furniture moved, floorboards examined, walls tapped for hollow spaces. The search produced damning evidence. Officers found a Minox camera, a small device designed specifically for covert photography of documents, hidden inside a hollowed-out book on a bedroom shelf. They found unexposed film, developed film that had not yet been passed to Western intelligence, and documents that appeared to be copies or photographs of classified materials. They found a cipher pad used for encoding messages, and they found approximately 5,000 rubles in cash, more money than a Soviet colonel would normally possess, hidden in a locked box in the garage. Around 1:30 a.m., Oleg was led from the apartment in handcuffs and placed in an unmarked car. Vera and the children, still confined to the bedroom by an officer standing guard, heard the car drive away. They would never see him again. The man being taken to Lubyanka Prison that night had spent the previous 18 months conducting one of the most productive espionage operations in Cold War history, providing the CIA and Britain's MI6 with more than 5,000 photographs of classified Soviet military documents. This intelligence included technical specifications for Soviet nuclear missiles, deployment schedules for strategic weapons systems, assessments of Soviet missile capabilities and limitations, and detailed information about the Soviet Union's actual nuclear arsenal, which Western intelligence discovered was significantly smaller and less advanced than feared. The material Penkovsky provided would prove crucial during the Cuban Missile Crisis, then just beginning to unfold, allowing American decision-makers to understand exactly what they faced in Cuba and to calibrate their response with precision rather than operating from fear and uncertainty. Understanding how Oleg Penkovsky reached this point requires examining the circumstances that shaped him and the grievances that made him receptive to betraying the state he had served for 2 decades. Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky was born on April 23, 1919, in Vladikavkaz in the North Caucasus region of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. His father, Vladimir Penkovsky, served as an officer in the White Army, the anti-Bolshevik forces that fought against the Red Army during the Russian Civil War following the 1917 revolution. Vladimir died in 1919 when Oleg was still an infant, killed during combat operations. Oleg's mother, Vera, subsequently married Zinovy Moroz, a Red Army officer who adopted Oleg and provided him with a new surname in official records, though Oleg would later reclaim his father's name. This family background, a biological father who had fought against the Bolsheviks, would become a source of profound problems for Oleg throughout his career, as Soviet authorities maintained detailed records of anyone whose family had opposed the revolution and considered such backgrounds evidence of political unreliability. Oleg grew up during the 1920s and 1930s, surviving Stalin's purges and proving himself an intelligent student with particular aptitude in mathematics and languages. In 1937, at age 18, he enrolled in the Kiev Artillery School, a military academy training Red Army artillery officers. He graduated in 1939 with a commission as a lieutenant and served with distinction during World War II, participating in defensive operations during the German invasion and in subsequent offensives as Soviet forces pushed westward. He was wounded twice, received multiple decorations including the Order of the Red Banner, and emerged from the war as a captain with a strong service record. In 1946, shortly after the war ended, Oleg married Vera Dmitrievna Gapanovich, a translator working with Soviet military administration in occupied Germany. Their first daughter, Galina, was born in 1947. Their second daughter, Marina, followed in 1950. The family appeared stable and conventional, a decorated war veteran building a career in the peacetime military, a wife who had given up her own career to raise their children, 2 daughters attending school, a modest apartment in Moscow. The critical turning point in Oleg's career came in 1948, when he was transferred to the GRU, the Military Intelligence Directorate of the Soviet Armed Forces. Assignment to the GRU was prestigious, indicating that superiors considered him trustworthy and capable. Between 1948 and 1955, he worked in various analytical positions at GRU headquarters in Moscow, attended the Military Diplomatic Academy, where he became fluent in English and proficient in French, and demonstrated strong analytical abilities regarding Western military systems. His performance earned him what should have been a career-defining assignment. In 1955, he was posted to Ankara, Turkey, as an assistant military attaché at the Soviet embassy, with his actual mission being intelligence collection against Turkish and NATO military capabilities. The posting to Turkey should have been a launching pad for advancement to senior positions within the GRU. Instead, it became the source of professional catastrophe. Approximately 1 year into his assignment in 1956, GRU security officers conducting a routine background review discovered that Penkovsky had not fully disclosed his father's service in the White Army during the Russian Civil War. While he had mentioned his father's military service, he had characterized it as service in the Imperial Russian Army prior to the Revolution, not as service in anti-Bolshevik forces during the Civil War. This concealment was considered serious evidence of political unreliability. Penkovsky was recalled from Turkey in late 1956, subjected to extensive interrogation by GRU counterintelligence, and questioned about why he had concealed his father's White Army service, whether he harbored counter-revolutionary sympathies, and whether he had engaged in unauthorized contacts with foreigners. He managed to avoid arrest or dismissal, but the consequences for his career were devastating. He was barred from future overseas postings, which effectively meant he could not advance to senior leadership positions within the GRU, as such positions required extensive foreign experience. He was assigned to a desk position at GRU headquarters, analyzing intelligence reports and preparing briefing materials. Important work, but offering no prospects for advancement. For Penkovsky, this represented profound professional humiliation. According to his own later statements to Western intelligence officers, he became increasingly bitter about what he perceived as unfair punishment for his father's actions rather than judgment based on his own merits and loyalty. He began to perceive favoritism within the GRU and Soviet military, where advancement seemed to depend more on political connections and party membership than on competence and service. This resentment festered over the following years and contributed to his eventual decision to commit treason. Between 1956 and 1960, Penkovsky continued working at GRU headquarters, promoted to colonel in 1958 based on time in service rather than any particular distinction. His marriage to Vera became strained, though they remained together. His daughters grew into adolescence, largely unaware of their father's professional difficulties or his growing disillusionment with the system he served. In August 1960, during a trade fair in Moscow attended by foreign business delegations, Penkovsky made his first attempt to contact Western intelligence. These trade fairs provided one of the few opportunities for direct contact between Soviet citizens and Westerners, though they were closely monitored by KGB counterintelligence. Penkovsky, attending the fair as part of his GRU duties, approached 2 American students and handed them an envelope, asking them to deliver it to the American embassy. The students, uncertain whether this was genuine or some sort of provocation, eventually complied. The envelope contained a letter identifying Penkovsky by his GRU position, stating that he had access to valuable intelligence about Soviet military capabilities, expressing willingness to work with Western intelligence, and requesting arrangements for secure communication. The CIA station in Moscow received the envelope with considerable skepticism. Unsolicited offers from sources claiming valuable access were often provocations orchestrated by Soviet counterintelligence. However, the documents included with Penkovsky's letter appeared authentic and contained information that would be extremely valuable if genuine. The CIA decided to respond cautiously, though establishing secure contact proved difficult over the following months. The breakthrough came in April 1961, when Penkovsky was assigned to accompany a Soviet trade delegation to London, a remarkable assignment given his earlier background problems, but apparently he had rehabilitated his reputation sufficiently. In London, Penkovsky made contact with representatives from both the CIA and MI6. The initial meetings took place at a safe house and involved extensive debriefing by CIA officer George Kiesewetter and MI6 officer Harold Shergold. Kiesewetter, then 41 years old, was one of the CIA's most experienced handlers of Soviet sources. He had worked on multiple successful operations against Soviet intelligence and possessed an exceptional ability to assess source motivations and reliability. Shergold, his British counterpart, brought complementary expertise from MI6's decades of experience operating against Soviet targets. Together, they spent approximately 2 weeks meeting with Penkovsky, assessing his bona fides, understanding his access, and evaluating his motivations. According to declassified debriefing reports, Penkovsky demonstrated detailed knowledge of Soviet military systems and provided information that cross-checked against existing intelligence, gradually establishing his credibility. He explained his position within GRU headquarters, describing his access to classified documents about Soviet military capabilities, weapons systems, and strategic planning. He proposed photographing these documents using a Minox camera that Western intelligence would provide, then passing the film during future trips abroad or through dead drops in Moscow. Kiesewetter and Shergold made the risks explicit. Discovery would mean execution. His family would face arrest, imprisonment, permanent stigmatization. Western intelligence could offer no realistic prospect of protection or extraction if he were compromised. Despite these warnings, Penkovsky insisted he understood the risks and was committed to proceeding. His stated motivations combined professional resentment over his stalled career with ideological claims about preventing nuclear war by providing accurate information about Soviet capabilities. Whether these ideological explanations represented genuine conviction or rationalization remains uncertain, but both officers assessed that Penkovsky's combination of access, motivation, and apparent stability made him worth the risk. By the time Penkovsky returned to Moscow at the end of April 1961, arrangements had been made. He had been provided with a Minox camera and film, trained in basic tradecraft, detecting surveillance, conducting counter-surveillance, using dead drops, handling emergencies. He had been given contact procedures for future meetings abroad and methods to signal urgent needs for contact. Over the following 16 months, from May 1961 until his arrest in October 1962, Penkovsky conducted an espionage operation of extraordinary productivity and risk. Working alone, with no network of sub-agents and only occasional direct contact with handlers, he photographed thousands of pages of classified Soviet military documents. He did this by removing documents from GRU files, photographing them at his apartment or other locations, then returning them before they could be missed. The risks were constant and extreme. Discovery could occur through a colleague noticing missing documents, through surveillance detecting his photography, through unexpected visitors, through random security checks. The intelligence Penkovsky photographed included technical manuals for Soviet nuclear missiles, particularly the R-12 system, known to NATO as the SS-4, and the R-14 system, known as the SS-5. These medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles represented some of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded secrets. The technical manuals revealed the missile's range, accuracy, payload capacity, guidance systems, fuel requirements, launch procedures, and operational limitations. This information allowed American analysts to understand exactly what these weapons could and could not do. Penkovsky also provided documents detailing Soviet missile production capabilities and deployment schedules, revealing that the Soviet Union possessed far fewer intercontinental ballistic missiles than American intelligence had feared. The so-called missile gap, the widespread belief that the Soviet Union possessed overwhelming superiority in strategic missiles, was largely fictitious. Soviet missiles were less reliable and less accurate than propaganda suggested. Additional material included Soviet military doctrine regarding nuclear weapons use, command and control procedures for strategic forces, assessments of military readiness and weaknesses, and information about Soviet intelligence operations against the West, including identities of some Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in Western capitals. Physical transfer of this intelligence occurred through multiple channels, during trips abroad as part of Soviet trade delegations, which occurred several times between May 1961 and August 1962. Penkovsky would bring film with him and meet with CIA or MI6 officers at safe houses. These meetings were brief, carefully arranged to avoid surveillance. He would provide film, receive new film and updated instructions, and participate in debriefings where he answered questions about the documents and current developments within the Soviet military. When Penkovsky could not travel abroad, communication was maintained through dead drops in Moscow. He would conceal film or messages at predetermined locations, taped behind a radiator in a public building, hidden in a hollowed-out brick, placed in a tree cavity in Moscow parks, where a CIA officer would later retrieve it. To signal that a dead drop had been loaded, Penkovsky would make a mark at a specific location, a chalk mark on a particular lamppost that CIA officers would observe during normal activities. After confirming the signal, the officer would retrieve the material and leave a signal confirming retrieval. These Moscow dead drops carried extraordinary risk for everyone involved. Moscow operated under comprehensive KGB surveillance. The Second Chief Directorate, responsible for counterintelligence against foreign intelligence services, routinely followed foreign diplomats and suspected intelligence officers. Their apartments were monitored with audio surveillance devices, telephone conversations were recorded, movements were tracked. CIA officers operating in Moscow had to assume constant surveillance and employ sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques to create brief windows when they could service a dead drop unobserved. The intelligence Penkovsky provided flowed to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, and to MI6 headquarters in London, where specialists analyzed it, cross-referenced it with other sources, and compiled assessments for senior policymakers. Some material was considered so important that it went directly to President Kennedy and British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. In October 1962, the value of Penkovsky's intelligence was demonstrated with devastating clarity. On October 14, 1962, a U.S. Air Force U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flying over Cuba photographed what appeared to be construction sites for Soviet medium-range ballistic missile installations. The photographs showed launch pads, missile assembly buildings, and support equipment that analysts recognized from Penkovsky's technical manuals as consistent with Soviet R-12 missile systems. Additional flights over following days confirmed that the Soviet Union was deploying nuclear-capable missiles in Cuba, approximately 90 miles from the U.S. mainland. The Cuban Missile Crisis represented the closest the world came to nuclear war during the Cold War. President Kennedy faced an agonizing choice: respond forcefully without appearing weak, but avoid escalation into military conflict that could rapidly spiral into nuclear catastrophe. Penkovsky's intelligence proved critical to American decision-making. Because of his technical manuals, analysts knew exactly what capabilities these missiles possessed, their range, accuracy, launch procedures, and limitations. They knew how long it would take Soviet forces to make the missiles operational, how many missiles were being deployed based on equipment visible in reconnaissance photographs, and what vulnerabilities existed. According to participants in crisis deliberations, including CIA analysts who briefed President Kennedy, This intelligence gave decision-makers confidence that the missiles were not yet operational, allowing time for diplomatic negotiations before military response became necessary. The intelligence also revealed that Soviet strategic forces were not mobilizing for immediate war, suggesting that Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was using the deployment as strategic gambit rather than preparation for first-strike nuclear attack. This assessment influenced the decision to pursue a naval blockade of Cuba rather than an immediate military strike against the missile sites, which some advisors recommended but which carried significant escalation risk. The crisis was ultimately resolved through public American demands that missiles be removed and private diplomatic negotiations in which the United States agreed to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey and provide assurances against invading Cuba. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle and remove the missiles. The crisis ended without military conflict, though the world had come perilously close to nuclear war. Even as the crisis unfolded, however, Penkovsky was already in custody, arrested 6 days before Kennedy's public announcement about the missiles. The circumstances of Penkovsky's compromise remain partially unclear, though KGB accounts from officers who later defected indicate that suspicion began in July or August 1962, approximately 2 to 3 months before arrest. Several factors contributed. Penkovsky's frequent travel abroad attracted attention from KGB counterintelligence, which maintained files on all Soviet citizens traveling abroad and looked for suspicious patterns. During trips to London and Paris between April 1961 and August 1962, KGB surveillance officers observed behaviors that seemed unusual: extended absences from hotels, unexplained gaps in schedules, meetings not documented in official delegation itineraries. Technical surveillance also played a role. The KGB routinely monitored foreign diplomats and suspected intelligence officers using physical surveillance, telephone taps, and hidden microphones. Surveillance of a CIA officer servicing a dead drop may have been detected, or a communication signal may have been observed and investigated. Once the KGB suspected an active operation, resources could be focused on identifying the source. By August 1962, the KGB had focused investigation on Penkovsky. Surveillance intensified. His apartment was searched while he was at work, allowing installation of additional listening devices and possibly discovery of evidence. His telephone calls were monitored more closely. His movements were tracked. The investigation and surveillance continued for approximately 2 months while evidence was accumulated, and while the KGB attempted to identify Western contacts and communication methods. The decision to arrest Penkovsky in late October may have been accelerated by the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet leadership, facing major confrontation with the United States and uncertain about the source of apparent American intelligence about Soviet missile capabilities, ordered immediate arrest rather than continuing surveillance. The timing, arresting Penkovsky on October 22nd, just 1 day after Kennedy publicly announced the discovery, strongly suggests connection. When KGB officers arrived at apartment 47 that evening and took Oleg Penkovsky into custody, they set in motion consequences that would destroy multiple lives and raise moral questions that remain unresolved more than 60 years later. At Lubyanka Prison, Penkovsky underwent interrogation over approximately 9 months, from October 1962 until his trial in May 1963. Interrogations were conducted by experienced KGB officers specializing in counterintelligence investigations. Techniques employed included lengthy questioning sessions, psychological pressure, threats regarding consequences for family members, promises of leniency in exchange for cooperation, and possibly physical abuse, Though specific details have never been fully disclosed, Penkovsky eventually provided extensive confessions describing his recruitment by Western intelligence, his methods of photographing classified documents, his dead drop procedures, and the information he had provided. These confessions formed the basis of the prosecution's case. During the investigation period, the KGB also assessed damage to Soviet security. Teams of officers and military specialists reviewed documents Penkovsky had accessed, attempting to determine what information he had passed to Western intelligence. This damage assessment revealed extraordinary scope. Thousands of pages of classified documents covering some of the Soviet Union's most sensitive military programs. The trial of Colonel Oleg Penkovsky began on May 7, 1963, inside the Moscow City Court building. Unlike some Soviet political trials conducted publicly as propaganda spectacles, Penkovsky's trial was closed to the public, with only carefully selected observers and journalists allowed to attend. The trial lasted 3 days. Penkovsky was represented by court-appointed defense counsel, though Soviet legal procedure in state security cases granted defense attorneys minimal ability to challenge prosecution evidence or mount effective defense. The prosecution presented materials seized from Penkovsky's apartment, records of his travel abroad, surveillance photographs documenting meetings with Western intelligence officers, transcripts of confessions, and testimony from KGB officers who conducted the investigation. Penkovsky, according to official accounts, confessed to all charges and provided detailed testimony about his espionage activities. On May 10, 1963, the tribunal returned its verdict: guilty on all charges of high treason and espionage against the Soviet state. Judge Viktor Borisov, who had served on the bench for military tribunals since the Stalinist purges of the 1930s, announced that Penkovsky would face capital punishment. Under Soviet procedure, defendants had the right to appeal their sentence to the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, but no appeal was filed. The execution was carried out on May 16, 1963, 6 days after sentencing. According to official announcement, Penkovsky was executed by firing squad at a location not specified in public records, presumably either at Lubyanka Prison or at a military facility in the Moscow area. His body was reportedly cremated, and his ashes were not returned to his family. Some later accounts suggested alternative execution methods, possibly incineration while still alive, in accordance with alleged procedures for particularly serious traitors, but these accounts remain unverified. For Vera Penkovsky and her daughters, the arrest, trial, and execution created catastrophe. Within days of Oleg's arrest, Vera lost her job. No employer would hire the wife of a convicted traitor. The apartment was seized by the state, forcing Vera and the daughters to relocate to a smaller apartment in a less desirable area of Moscow. Galina and Marina were expelled from their schools. Other children, informed by parents about Oleg's treason, avoided them or actively bullied them. Teachers treated them with suspicion or hostility. Vera struggled to find work. She eventually found employment doing manual labor at a factory, work that paid poorly and required long hours. The family survived on this meager income, supplemented by occasional assistance from Vera's relatives, who themselves faced social stigma because of their connection to the family. The practical consequences, poverty, poor housing, limited food, were compounded by pervasive social stigma. Being the family of a traitor meant facing restrictions on employment opportunities, educational opportunities, Communist Party membership, and even on where they could live. They were subject to ongoing KGB surveillance and periodic questioning. They were expected to publicly denounce the traitor and demonstrate their own loyalty to the state. Galina, age 15 at the time of her father's arrest, dropped out of school, and began working at age 16 to help support the family. She worked various jobs, waitressing, cleaning, factory work, throughout her adolescence and early adulthood. Her opportunities for education and career advancement were eliminated by her father's treason. She married in her early 20s, partly to escape the stigma of her maiden name, though her marriage was troubled and ended in divorce after several years. Marina, only 12 when her father was arrested, had even less understanding of what had happened. Vera struggled to explain the situation to a child, telling Marina that her father had made serious mistakes that had harmed the country, but not explaining the full nature of his espionage activities until Marina was older. Marina also left school early and began working in her mid-teens. Like her sister, her life opportunities were severely constrained. For children like Galina and Marina, growing up as family of a traitor meant living with constant awareness that they were viewed as politically unreliable, that their opportunities were limited, and that they carried a burden of shame for actions they had not committed and could not control. The psychological impact of this, the trauma of watching their father arrested, the shame and confusion of learning what he had done, the poverty and social ostracism that followed, shaped the rest of their lives. Vera Penkovsky survived her husband by approximately 25 years, dying in the late 1980s. Throughout those years, she maintained that she had known nothing about Oleg's espionage activities and that she had been as shocked and betrayed by his actions as Soviet authorities. Whether this was entirely true or whether she had suspected something was wrong but chose not to investigate is impossible to determine. What is certain is that she paid a terrible price, losing her home, her career, her social standing, and any prospect of comfortable life for herself or her children. For Western intelligence services, Penkovsky's arrest represented loss of their most valuable intelligence asset inside the Soviet military establishment. The CIA and MI6 conducted extensive post-mortem analyses, attempting to determine what led to his compromise and whether other operations had been jeopardized. The conclusion was that Penkovsky had been detected through Soviet counterintelligence surveillance rather than through betrayal by a Western source, though the exact mechanism remained uncertain. George Kiesewetter, who had conducted many of Penkovsky's debriefing sessions, later reflected on the operation with professional satisfaction about the intelligence provided and profound sadness about the outcome. In interviews after his retirement from the CIA, Kiesewetter described Penkovsky as courageous, intelligent, and genuinely motivated by conviction that he was helping prevent nuclear war. Kiesewetter also acknowledged guilt about Penkovsky's execution and the destruction of his family, even while maintaining that the intelligence had been crucial to Western security during a critical period. The information Penkovsky provided continued to be valuable for years after his death. Technical details about Soviet missile systems informed American weapons development and military planning throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Insights into Soviet military doctrine and strategic thinking influenced Western assessments of Soviet intentions and capabilities. Identities of Soviet intelligence officers he exposed led to compromise of Soviet intelligence operations in multiple countries. Galina died in the early 2000s, according to records obtained by researchers studying Cold War espionage cases. She had lived much of her adult life in relative poverty, working manual labor jobs, and had maintained minimal contact with her younger sister. Marina survived into the 2000s, though information about her later life is scarce. Neither daughter ever publicly discussed their father or his espionage activities, declining interview requests from journalists and researchers. Both maintained that their father's actions had destroyed their family and that they wanted no association with his legacy. The Soviet government, and later the Russian government after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, never rehabilitated Oleg Penkovsky or acknowledged any mitigation of his crimes. In the Soviet narrative, he remained a traitor who had betrayed his country for personal gain, motivated by greed and treachery rather than idealistic conviction. This narrative persisted even after the Cold War ended, when some other intelligence cases were reassessed and some individuals posthumously pardoned. Penkovsky remained unrehabilitated, his treason still regarded as indefensible. The question of whether Oleg Penkovsky's espionage accomplished what he claimed to have intended, preventing nuclear war by providing Western leaders with accurate information about Soviet capabilities, cannot be answered with certainty. The intelligence he provided influenced American decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and many historians and participants have argued that having accurate intelligence about Soviet missile capabilities contributed to the crisis being resolved peacefully rather than escalating to war. From this perspective, Penkovsky's espionage helped prevent catastrophic outcome. However, the fundamental dynamics of the confrontation, two nuclear-armed superpowers facing a situation where neither could afford to appear weak, but where both recognized that war would be catastrophic, existed regardless of intelligence available. The crisis was ultimately resolved through diplomatic negotiation and mutual concession. Whether the specific technical details Penkovsky provided about missile capabilities were crucial to enabling this resolution, or whether other factors would have produced the same outcome regardless, remains unclear. What is certain is the human cost. Oleg Penkovsky's choices destroyed his family, causing his wife and daughters to live diminished lives marked by poverty, stigma, and lost opportunities. His espionage compromised Soviet military secrets, affecting Soviet strategic planning. His intelligence provided Western leaders with information that influenced crucial decisions during the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. His arrest, trial, and execution demonstrated both the possibilities and the limits of human espionage in a surveillance state. The tension between strategic necessity and human cost remains unresolved. Intelligence services have typically justified operations like Penkovsky's by pointing to larger strategic interests: national security, prevention of war, protection of millions who benefit from intelligence successes, even if they never know about them. Critics point to specific individuals who suffer: families destroyed, lives ruined, the moral costs of treating people as means to ends rather than ends in themselves. Both perspectives contain truth. Oleg Penkovsky believed, or claimed to believe, that providing intelligence to the West would help prevent nuclear war and was therefore justified despite the risks. The CIA and MI6 believed that recruiting and handling Penkovsky was justified by the extraordinary value of intelligence he provided. Vera, Galina, and Marina Penkovsky paid the price for those beliefs, living with consequences they did not choose and could not escape. Whether Penkovsky should be judged as hero, traitor, or something more complicated depends on which perspective you prioritize. From the perspective of Western security during the Cold War, he was a valuable asset who provided crucial intelligence at a critical time. From the perspective of Soviet security, he was a traitor who betrayed his country's most sensitive secrets. From the perspective of his family, he was a husband and father who made choices that destroyed their lives. From his own stated perspective, he was someone trying to prevent nuclear war by providing accurate information. All perspectives are simultaneously true, and none fully captures the complexity of his choices and their consequences. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The nuclear confrontation that had defined international relations for 4 decades gradually receded, though nuclear weapons remained. Intelligence services that had recruited and handled sources like Penkovsky continued operating in changed strategic environments. Files documenting espionage cases were gradually declassified, allowing historians to reconstruct events that had been shrouded in secrecy. But for families affected by Cold War espionage, families like the Penkovskys, no amount of declassification or historical reassessment could undo damage that had been done. The stigma, the lost opportunities, the poverty, the trauma, these consequences persisted regardless of how historians later evaluated the strategic significance of the operations that caused them. Oleg Penkovsky was 43 when KGB officers arrested him in his Moscow apartment on that October evening in 1962. He was 44 when he faced the firing squad in May 1963. In the 18 months between April 1961 and October 1962, he provided intelligence that influenced superpower confrontation during the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. He did this knowing the risks to himself, though perhaps not fully anticipating the consequences for his family. He did this believing, or claiming to believe, that he was helping prevent nuclear catastrophe. Whether he was right about this is a question without definitive answer. What can be stated with certainty is that his choices destroyed his family, provided Western intelligence with extraordinarily valuable information during a critical period, resulted in his own execution, and left moral questions that remain unresolved more than 6 decades later. His daughters lost their father, their home, their education, and their future opportunities. His wife lost her husband, her career, and her social standing. Soviet military security was compromised. Western intelligence gained crucial information. The Cold War continued, eventually ending not through espionage revelations but through economic exhaustion and political transformation. The photograph of Oleg Penkovsky, taken during his trial in May 1963, shows a man in military uniform standing at attention in the courtroom, his face expressionless. His shoulders square despite months of imprisonment and interrogation. He looks neither defiant nor broken, neither heroic nor villainous. He looks like an ordinary man, middle-aged, somewhat tired, facing consequences of choices he had made, believing they were justified, now recognizing that the consequences were far more severe than perhaps he had fully anticipated. The photograph captured a moment near the end of his life, but revealed nothing about whether he believed his espionage had been worth the cost, whether he felt regret about what his choices had done to his family, or whether he still believed he had been serving a cause greater than his own life. Those internal states remain unknown. What is known is that he made choices, that those choices had consequences, and that those consequences rippled outward, affecting people who had no voice in any of it. And in the end, that is what cases like Penkovsky's force us to confront. Not simple questions of loyalty and betrayal, but complex questions about responsibility, consequence, and the human cost of treating intelligence collection as paramount regardless of who pays the price.